Hello and welcome, or welcome back if you joined us yesterday. I'm David Kramer at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and want to welcome you to State of the World 2021 for day 2, where we have a terrific lineup here today. And kicking us off is going to be a book discussion that will be led by our moderator, but also our partner in this conference, Mark Green, who's executive director of the McCain Institute, who joined us yesterday for a fascinating conversation with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And then we'll be leading the discussion here today with two old friends of mine, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. So Mark, let me turn it over to you, and thanks very much.
Great, thank you, David. It's great to be with you, great to be part of the conference, and having been a participant yesterday, I'm awfully pleased with the response that we're all getting. So first off, we're going to have a discussion for about a half an hour, and then I want to take questions from those of you who are watching. Use the Q&A function that you have with Zoom. So this morning, Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst for MSNBC. Susan Glasser is a staff writer for The New Yorker and a global analyst for CNN. Their first assignment as a married couple was as the Washington bureau chiefs in Moscow. That led to their book, Kremlin Rising. Their latest collaboration is The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. It has received rave reviews, and let me add my own voice of praise. Now, as I had in our previous discussion indicated, this is not a short book, and yet there is not one page that I would drop. Every single page adds to the story, and a remarkable story it is. So Peter, Susan, thank you for joining us this morning, and congratulations on the success of this work, of this book.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great to be with you, and congratulations to you on your new assignment as head of the Wilson Center, which is a wonderful Washington institution.
Where this book was partly written, yeah. As Jane Harmon would want us to tell you.
No, great. Thank you. You're very kind. So our book. So the book basically begins and ends with the same question. Will James Baker endorse, support, vote for Donald J. Trump? How does it turn out? And what does his sort of inner turmoil in thinking about that question, what does that say about James Baker, his times, and his approach?
Well, it's a great question. You're right. We did begin and end it. I don't want to spoil the ending, but what's really fascinating about this question is Susan and I started this book 7 years before it was published, 2013, back during the Obama era. So it was not really a Trump-related book, but even then, Washington felt broken in so many important ways. And we thought that the Jim Baker story told us a couple of things. One, it told us about his own remarkable life as White House chief of staff of 2 presidents, as the leader of 5 presidential campaigns, Secretary of Treasury, and then, of course, Secretary of State at the end of the Cold War. But we also thought his story told us a story about Washington and how much had changed, how things used to work and how things work today. And that only became more so with the rise of Donald Trump. And as Trump began to appear on the horizon, our conversations with Baker increasingly, of course, turned to that subject because he was so anathema to everything we think Baker stood for, both ideologically in terms of how he thinks of republicanism and also just the way he viewed public service and government. And yet, despite that, Baker had this, we watched him struggle with this. He didn't particularly think much of Trump. He used the words crazy to describe him. He called him nuts. He despised some of the things he had done to dismantle traditional republicanism, and he just obviously has no truck for the false statements and the invective and nastiness, and yet he couldn't ever fully break from him. He voted for him in 2016, even though his best friend George Bush didn't vote for him, and he did end up voting for him again in 2020. And we asked that question repeatedly: why would you do that, given that he doesn't really particularly seem your kind of guy? And the answer basically, I think, is it's a lot about our tribal nature today. We are, us and them moment in society. You're either a Republican or you're not. And he told us at one point, I'm a Republican, even if my party has left me. And so I think that that's a parable for the modern Republican Party and a lot of established Republicans who end up sticking with Trump over these last 4 years, even though they don't particularly like him.
And yet he began his career as a Democrat.
Well, that's right. In a way, again, to this point about the arc of the modern Republican Party, the Republican Party began in, its transition really at the time that Jim Baker began the switch from being a sort of indifferent at best Southern Democrat from a very conservative family. He doesn't really remember much about politics growing up, except that his father passionately hated FDR. I think they were sort of Texas aristocracy and saw FDR as sort of a class traitor. But other than that, really, the family motto was to stay out of politics. So it wasn't so much even that Baker was a Democrat as that he was a non-participant in public life. And his family ethos really was work hard and stay out of politics, going back to he is the son, grandson, and great-grandson of prominent Texas attorneys who really were more than lawyers. They were, in effect, founders and builders of the city of Houston. And, the family had really a strong aversion to anything that smacked of politics. And, there's a fantastic story when he finally did become Secretary of State in the administration of his close friend from the Houston Country Club, George Herbert Walker Bush. His mother at this point is still alive. She's in her late 90s. She wasn't able to travel up to Washington. And he calls her up on the phone and she says, well, Jimmy, tell me what that job is again you have. And he says, well, Mom, Secretary of State. And she says, of the whole United States? And he says, yes, Mom, of the whole United States. And she says, well, I guess it's probably a good thing your father isn't alive. He really wouldn't have approved of that.
Well, and you point to something else that comes through in the book. You get the question over and over again, what was Baker's ideology? So you understood the different challenges that he took on, often on behalf, obviously, of other people. But what's Baker's ideology? What drives him? What is his passion in terms of political ideology?
Yeah, I think that Baker is a conservative. I mean, he is a Texas conservative, but it's not an ideologue. He doesn't fall on a sword on ideology when it comes to doing things, right? So as a White House official, as a cabinet secretary, his first priority was to get things done. And he told us again and again that that's what Reagan wanted him to do. When he was Reagan's chief of staff, even though Reagan, of course, we think of as an icon of the conservative movement, the Reagan himself was more of a pragmatist than people today would like to imagine to have been. And then, in fact, Reagan said over and over, I'd rather get 80% of what I'm after rather than fly my flag, jumping over the cliff. And that was Baker's approach too. So he would do deals with Democrats on Social Security, on the tax code, on foreign policy, because it was more important to him to get things done than to stand on some sort of false notion of ideological purity.
Yeah, something else, you touch upon those Reagan days, and I was struck by some of the eerie similarities to the earliest days of Trump, in the sense that you had a number of outsiders, people who weren't from Washington or weren't from government at all. A difference being in the Reagan days, Reagan understood he needed a Baker.
Yes.
And so Baker was the guy that sort of managed things and kept people perhaps at arm's length who could have taken things off the rails. We didn't see a parallel in the early days and the following months of the Trump administration. So that to me seemed to be parallels, but then a complete divergence.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because actually I think that that's a really important point. First of all, it goes to your first question. Why did Jim Baker very, very reluctantly choose to vote for Trump the first time around? And I think part of the explanation is his experience with Reagan. He made this analogy to me once in a conversation that we had right after, like a couple weeks after the inauguration of Trump. It was his first interview after that. And he said, well, yeah, I remember when Reagan came up and he was an outsider and we were so terrified a nuclear war was going to happen or something. And in effect, it worked out okay. And I think that his notion was that, first of all, that the office of the president of the United States would actually have an influence on the president, and that Trump would want to succeed in that office. And so I think it was almost the failed analogizing between these two, in the end, very different outsiders that might have been responsible for why Baker and some other Republicans thought things would work out better with Trump than they ultimately did. So I think that's one important point. But definitely the Reagan White House was an extraordinary, almost a cesspool of intrigue and backbiting and internecine warfare. And Baker, was right in the middle of it. And, Peter actually got a text from a senior former Trump official said, "I'm reading your book. It sounds an awful lot like what I remember of our Trump White House, except," and this was, again, someone who worked for Trump, "except that Baker was much more competent." And so that's one thing. And I do think fundamentally, what's so actually offensive in a way is the comparison between Reagan and Trump, because they were basically such fundamentally different people. And that is actually the reason that the two White Houses were so different in the end. They reflected the personalities, the liabilities of the two leaders. And Donald Trump was never going to empower a Jim Baker to succeed, which is why whenever Peter and I get these questions, who could be, Jim Baker in the Trump era, the answer is no one, because Donald Trump, as you know, as we all know, and by this point, wants to be at the center of all the action. That's why he had 4 national security advisors, more than anyone since the position was created, 4 chiefs of staff, firing people so often. By the end of his administration, no one even knew who was in what job, because fundamentally it didn't really matter. That's just a complete opposite approach in many ways, because the person was different.
Yeah, and it seems to me that another way of thinking of it is that Donald Trump did have a chief of staff himself, right? And so he nudged aside anybody else who wanted to play that role. And perhaps the difference was that Reagan, who we conservatives think of in big picture aspirational ways, but he also had a certain humility and realized what he couldn't do, and that he couldn't be chief of staff, and that he had to have somebody who could implement and guide and take care of those details, and thus James A. Baker III.
Well, they're right. People forget, while the analogy that Baker and some others made about Trump and Reagan was that they were both sort of entertainers, right? They were both outsiders. They were both people who kind of had a showmanship quality to them. And that's the analogy. The difference was that Reagan has served 2 terms as governor of the largest state. He'd actually run something in government. He knew how government worked by that point. Not Washington, but he knew how government worked. And he was serious about it. And I think that the other thing is, you're right. He did understand his own, strengths and weaknesses, and it spoke amazingly to Reagan that he would pick somebody for his chief of staff who would run not 1 but 2 campaigns against him. Baker, of course, ran Ford in '76 when they beat Reagan at the convention, and Bush in 1980 when they lost the primaries. And I think that Reagan understood something about Baker and what he needed that Trump never did.
Well, and not to belabor this too much, but also just even as entertainers, quote unquote, the role that Donald Trump played as an entertainer was himself. The role that Ronald Reagan played was that of other people.
Yeah.
And Reagan was, in the end, also, he was the ideologue that Baker wasn't, right? Actually, if you read other portraits of Reagan, it's very clear, he was wired with the ideology of the Reagan Revolution. So he wasn't looking to hire that in Baker. What he was looking to hire was somebody who was an executor and an implementer. And again, Trump's ideology was himself.
And one last thing, Trump always ran, sorry, we're getting going on this, but Trump never ran anything other than the Trump Organization,
Yes.
which was a wholly owned subsidiary of Trump.
That's right.
There were no shareholders. There was no board. There was never a constituency that he had to answer to. It was always his own, whims on the 26th floor of Trump Tower. Whereas Reagan, again, had built constituencies, not just as governor for 8 years, but also as president of the Screen Actors Guild and in other roles over the years.
It's something else that came through to me in the book. So there's perhaps some inner turmoil for James Baker in how he would be seen. So, he was referred to as the fixer and the velvet hammer and so on and so forth. And you could see he kind of chafes against that a little bit. But what I saw in how Baker took on his role was much more akin to an experience that I had on a very low level as an assistant whip in the House of Representatives. I love being an assistant whip. It was a great training ground because it forced you, with each person with whom you're working, to understand their district, what they could do, what they couldn't do, when they were BSing you on talking about an issue or a vote, and you had to craft something that appealed to them. And it seems to me that that was Baker's skill, not just fixing a problem, but his ability to understand the various levers of politics and what he could do, but always for that outcome, whether it be a Reagan-esque outcome, or in the case of his very good friend, George H.W. Bush, on some of the challenges that came up during their administration.
I think that is a great insight. Fundamentally, Baker applied a similar skill set, whether it was to working with the Soviets on arms control, or it was working with Republicans and Democrats on tax reform in 1986. And, look, as Treasury Secretary, it wasn't that he brought a big background in economics to the table. In fact, he'd only had a single economics course at Princeton and probably didn't do all too well at that. So really, Baker's skill set, I do think fundamentally was politics. Now, that was a dirty word in his family, as I've said, so part of his allergy with that. I think part of it was that he saw politics from his own experience as a rather grubby business. One thing to remember about Baker's really long and extraordinary portfolio was that it was his formative experience in politics came in the 1976 contested convention, when through an unlikely series of circumstances, at the age of 45, by the way, it was an extremely successful mid-career switch. At the age of 45, he finds himself suddenly the delegate counter for the incumbent president of the United States in what would turn out to be the final contested convention at the floor in US history. And that was very grubby business. People were outright asking for, favors and demanding Oval Office meetings of Jerry Ford and seats at state dinners with Queen Elizabeth. And, this was, I think, unseemly to Baker. And in fact, one of the things that was, real privilege to us in doing this biography was the opportunity to have unfettered access to his papers, both at Princeton and Rice University. And, he kept a file all these years of, things that people had asked him that he considered to be inappropriate or unethical or just, problematic. And, it's, I think, something that did color his view of politics in the narrow sense, which is ironic because he termed his own memoir of his time as Secretary of State, The Politics of Diplomacy. And I do think that in a way, what he wasn't making a big contribution to the theory of international relations. What he was is an exceptionally skilled practitioner of the art of making it happen. And so I think that Politics of Diplomacy title was really a well-founded one for him.
And as we've been talking, obviously for all those who are listening, it's a reminder, we tend to focus on Baker's accomplishments by talking about the offices he held. And of course, that doesn't begin to do justice. It was the causes and the challenges that he was in the midst of, from, Secretary of State, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the wall, building that remarkable coalition to take on Saddam Hussein, China, Russia, Egypt, Syria, all being part to different degrees of that coalition. And so as we talk about Baker, it's not the titles, it really is the outcomes, which were extraordinary.
Well, I think that's exactly right. It's a good reminder to us because a lot of people have good titles in Washington, but don't, leave office without having gotten very much done, maybe through no fault of their own, or maybe because of the times they happen to live in. But Baker was Secretary of State, just to focus on that, an extraordinary, pivot point in world history, right? Probably in some ways the most extraordinary 3 or 4 years in foreign affairs of our lifetime, or at least recent last 2 generations, let's say. And it wasn't that he was the revolutionary, right? He didn't create revolution in Russia or Eastern Europe. He didn't create the change that was happening. But what he did do was he helped marshal it, right? He helped channel it toward a constructive and peaceful ending in the case of the fall of communism and the fall of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I mean, think about that. It was not inevitable that the Soviet Union would go away and that Eastern Europe would be freed from the shackles of Moscow without violence, without significant violence. And yet that's what happened, partly because of Bush and Baker. And I think Germany is the case study in the, his particular diplomacy, right? Being able to bring together these two Germanys. He didn't have to just negotiate between two Germanys or negotiate with the Soviet Union. He had to negotiate with the British and the French because Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand weren't thrilled about the idea of a reunited Germany either, for good reason, after 2 wars in the last century. Remember, I think the saying at the time was, we love Germany so much, let's have 2 of them. But, he managed to figure that out and in fact negotiate between 2 different West German factions, one of which held the chancellorship and the other held the foreign ministry at that particular time. And he did it in such a way that kept Germany NATO without having alienated the conservatives in Moscow who could have, resisted this and even toppled Mikhail Gorbachev at the time. Remember, the Soviets still had 300,000 troops in East Germany at that time. They could have stopped it if they wanted to. And he did it in time before the invasion of Kuwait that would have changed in some ways the dynamics in which he was negotiating. So I think that was a great case study of action resulting in an outcome.
When I was at the International Republican Institute, one of our board members was Brent Scowcroft. And I went to visit General Scowcroft to talk to him. One of the questions I asked him was what advice he had for the newer, younger members of the International Republican Institute, and those going into foreign policy. He said something interesting to me. He said, we have a tendency to look back on those days that you just described and think that it was inevitable, right? That the wall was going to fall, Germany was going to be reunified. And he said to me, it wasn't inevitable. It wasn't easy, and it was very often in doubt. So do you think that James Baker is able to look back on those days with a sense of pride and understand the role that he played? Or, there's so many different things that he did. Does he truly appreciate the difference that he made in those pivotal moments, and how different things would be if he had not gotten into that grubby game of politics?
That is a great and important observation. I do think that was, for Peter and I, our original interest in many ways in doing the book was because of this period of the end of the Cold War, having spent 4 years in Moscow in the former Soviet Union, basically just a decade after these events, during the period when Vladimir Putin came to power. By the way, an example of the alternate course that could have been taken at any moment in time preceding it. And, Baker, in particular, that diplomacy surrounding the reunification of Germany, when he and Bush and Scowcroft came into office in 1989, the diplomats at the State Department prepared a famous memo that was on the question of German unification. And the conclusion that the authors very reluctantly came to was, forget it. It's a pipe dream. It's a fantasy. It's not going to happen in our lifetime. And there were a few dissenting voices, but just a few. And when November 9th, 1989 happened, there was no playbook for what came after it. There was no plan in effect, and it all had to be done on the fly and in a very, very rapid way. Now, interestingly, it's often said that team of Scowcroft, Bush, Baker, and Dick Cheney at the Defense Department was, probably the gold standard of national security and foreign policy teams, in the sense of both how they worked together and how Scowcroft, as national security advisor, managed to harmonize the often disharmonious, bureaucratically feuding apparatus of the U.S. state. And, I think Scowcroft genuinely is credited with that. But of course, we've seen over and over again, people can talk about the Scowcroft model. They talk about, I'm going to run my NSC just like that. It's not actually about the process of the meetings that you hold and, who's invited to what, right? It's not just about having breakfast once a week with your counterparts, because in the end, it was about that group of people, their ability to work together. And interestingly, German unification is probably an example where Baker, who was extremely cautious as a general principle, Margaret Tutwiler, who was one of his absolute closest aides all the way from, being Reagan, White House, all the way through to Secretary of State, she called him Mr. Caution. And yet on German unification, when he understood and sensed the importance of this deal, and he was immersed in it in a tactile way, even more than Scowcroft and Bush, that was the moment when Baker really pushed that relationship with Scowcroft and Bush. And I found that to be very interesting, that he was the one, the cautious one normally, who really said, this is it, we have to go for it. he came up with the diplomats at the State Department with this formula of how to incorporate the four victorious World War II powers, but also the two Germanys. And this was the moment when Baker basically pushed aside Scowcroft and Bush and said, "I've got this one, boys." And so I do think, to your question, that he understands that that's his sort of play for history.
Interesting. So what comes through in the book is that for much of his career, he wanted to be Secretary of State. And of course, it eventually happens. Other parts of his career, his life, did he want to be president? Sounds like he did. Certainly some others wanted him to be president or run for president. Does he have a sense that, is there a sense of lack of fulfillment on that? And B, does he realize that even if he wasn't president, he may have been prime minister at least a few moments?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. We were going through these files that Susan mentioned at Princeton, and we came across a folder from his time as Secretary of Treasury in which he had saved dozens of letters that people had written him saying, "You ought to be president. You ought to run for president." This is back in 1980. He was still working for Reagan. And I thought that was a really eye-opening discovery because it said this is somebody who not only thought about it, he saved these letters and put them in his archives years later. He didn't do that because he dismissed it out of hand. And he did think about it, obviously. He thought about running in 1996. I think anybody like him who had been in the presence of the Oval Office and the White House for so long gets that feeling like, I could do this. These guys are mortal and human. I'm as good as they are, if not better. But we asked him about that during one of our interviews. Why didn't you run, sir, in 1996? And I have to say, if you're a biographer, I've learned the lesson. Try to interview your subject with their spouse if they're available, because they are the truth tellers. And his answer was, well, I had been at the top of the game for, all these years. I was tired. I was exhausted at that point. And his wife jumps in, Susan Baker, who's wonderful. She says, well, honey, she says, the party had begun moving on. You were too liberal for them. And by that, she meant not that he was literally a liberal, but that the party of Gingrich, which had arisen in 1994, was different than the party of Reagan and Bush that Baker had so mastered. And that Baker was seen too much as a compromiser. It was seen too much as a pragmatist. And that was an era when that was no longer valued the same way. And I think that's right. There wasn't traction for him to run in 1996. And he's a clever enough guy to know that that was the case. And I think the truth is he wouldn't have enjoyed running for president. He would have enjoyed being president.
Yeah. I could go on for a long time, but we're going to turn to audience questions. But as we do, one question, if you could respond, we have so many students of journalism and aspiring journalists that are listening in, your advice to them. You've obviously had a front row seat to an awful lot, written on so many different things. What advice do you have for those entering the field of journalism?
Well, apologize to your parents, but look, we're so lucky because the world is constantly reinventing itself. There's no such thing as stupid questions. And in an age where it seems like we're surfeited with every amount of information, so much of it is bogus or untrue or partial or misleading. I think that as much as people write and think about the crisis, which is genuine in the business model of journalism, it seems like there has never been a more important and even foundational moment for journalism in America. Peter and I spent 4 years living, as I said, in the former Soviet Union. I never ever thought in my life that we would return home to the United States to find the President of the United States calling journalists enemies of the people, which, by the way, is the term vrag naroda in Russian, by which millions and millions of people were sentenced to the gulag in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist era. So guess what? It matters, folks. And I think the last 4 years have been an incredible example of why it matters. We're back to first principles in this country. We're so divided, and this is such an important job, and it's a wonderful, wonderful job too. So I would say good luck to all the students who are listening.
But it's worth doing, is your message.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. So just as we get going, a question. Obviously, Donald Trump, known for the art of the deal, and sees himself as a deal maker. And yet, when you take a look at outcomes, it was actually James Baker that was the deal maker. But did they view deals differently? In the Trump administration, was a transactional one-off series of one-offs, and with Baker, did he view doing a deal as more building commerce? In other words, a relationship that you could go back to. Is that the principal difference?
Yeah, I think that is a principal difference. I think it's a very smart insight. And I think obviously the eras were different, as Susan was saying earlier. But you had Baker, who in 1983 sits down with Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, and cuts a deal to put Social Security on a firmer footing for years. It's the last time that's happened on a bipartisan basis. He does it again in 1986 with Dan Rostenkowski and the Democrats to rewrite the tax code from top to bottom. Again, the last time that's happened on a bipartisan basis. 1 month after eviscerating Michael Dukakis in the 1988 election. I mean, Baker was a ruthless partisan when it came to elections. He was no softy. But 1 month after that election, he's in the apartment at the Watergate of Bob Strauss, the former Democratic National Committee chairman, having dinner with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, to figure out a way to make the Contra War go away, a process that also had Baker work with Jimmy Carter. So Baker didn't sit there and think, I'm just going to work with my party and forget the other side and ram through what I can. I'm going to do what we can to get the other party to buy in. Now, why to do that? First of all, of course, during the 12 years of Reagan and Bush, he had no choice. The Democrats had the House the entire time, and they had the Senate half that time. But I think also Baker understood that if you wanted something to last, something that was enduring, it was better to have bipartisan buy-in. Why did he tell George H.W. Bush to go to Congress to get permission to go to war against Saddam Hussein? Not because he thought constitutionally he had to necessarily, but because he thought it would be better to have bipartisan buy-in, especially if things went wrong. And I think that's something that Trump never really understood. And I think the times, it's not just Trump, of course. I think these times are pulling us apart in that way. I mean, both Democrats and Republicans these days see it as, disadvantageous to do compromise. And I think that's a real problem for the country right now.
So, Susan, we've got a question here that puts you a bit on the spot. Said that you did a very marvelous profile of Pompeo about a year ago. How would you compare and contrast Pompeo and Secretary of State James A. Baker III?
Well, I would say that, Baker would say it's always advantageous to be compared to somebody who is not known for doing a good job. And the truth is that they were might have had the same job title, but what they did was so completely different from each other. It's frankly hard even to compare it. In part, of course, because the moment and the in time was different. The U.S. role in the world was different. But fundamentally, Pompeo will be remembered as one of the worst and certainly most politicized secretaries of state we've had in our history. This is a guy who addressed the Republican National Convention from Jerusalem, who seemed to govern by hashtag and sort of statements that were aimed at this audience of one, the boss in the White House, and the palpable insecurity of the entire Trump administration, because as we were saying earlier, all stars revolved around this overweening and overwhelming son of Donald Trump, right? It was interesting that in the very first year, before Pompeo even became Secretary of State, Trump was asked actually about all the vacancies at the State Department. And that's when he gave his very revealing quote, "I'm the only one that matters," which, could have been almost like the slogan for his entire administration, right? But it's interesting that it came in the context of the State Department. Pompeo was essentially a backbencher Republican congressman with not a lot of experience on Capitol Hill. He'd never even chaired a subcommittee, never mind a full committee. His major experience was basically going on Fox News and talking about the endless series of Benghazi investigations of Hillary Clinton. And so I think he brought that experience on Capitol Hill, which was of the hyper politicized sort of new House Republican conference. And he actually just applied that model into the sort of toxic court politics of the Trump administration. His best known thing, I think, will be the fact that he insisted on branding himself as the secretary of hashtag swagger at the State Department. And diplomats, of course, are not really known for that. It seemed to be an effort to rebrand diplomacy as sort of George Patton, the movie, which is Donald Trump's favorite movie. And, Baker was really just the opposite of that in every way. But one final point on how different American statecraft is today versus then. Baker's relentless consultations with our allies and partners. This is something that really leapt out at us when we re-examined this period of the end of the Cold War. It wasn't just that he was in constant contact with Brent Scowcroft and George Bush back in the White House. Baker would literally, he would fly to Moscow for a meeting. And on the way there, he would stop in Brussels or in Germany and consult with allied leaders. He would say, here's what I'm going to talk about here. What do you think? What's your latest intelligence from Moscow? He would go to Russia. He would have the meeting with Gorbachev, Shevardnadze. Then he would fly back and he would stop in Brussels on the way back and he would say, here's what happened. Here's what I think we should do next. What do you think? What do you think? This was came naturally to him, right? He didn't spend a career doing this. And think about how our Secretary of State had to cancel his final meeting in Brussels, the final trip of the Trump administration, because he was not welcome in Brussels and they wouldn't meet with him. I think that tells you everything about the difference between these two.
I'm struck by in the book the number of times he used fishing or hunting as a vehicle for diplomacy, something we don't see quite as much these days. So our references to journalism lit up a number of viewers. One question that was put forward is, it says that our major media houses, our leading media houses, are moving towards homogeneity and point of view. Is that a problem? And what needs to be done to combat that in the role of journalism in modern politics and in global affairs?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that, the truth is, I think that one thing that we have now that we didn't have back in the Baker era is a much broader marketplace of ideas, a much broader array of possible media sources that you can turn to depending on your point of view and what you're looking for than we ever had in the Reagan and Bush eras. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think it's the consequence of a fragmentation of the media means that some people only go to media that agrees with their preconceived notion, whether you're on the left or the right. And therefore, we're not starting from the same fact set anymore. We actually have different, bases for the conversation that we're having than we used to have in the old days. But if you're looking for something different than what you're getting in my newspaper or some other newspaper, there's a place to find it. There's no shortage right now of very, often very good, organizations or commentary outlets for all sorts of different points of view. So I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about how we at least get people, regardless of ideology, how we get people on the same fact basis, so that we can have an argument about what to do, at least starting from the same vantage point of references.
So a couple of other questions in that same general area. What do we need to do to rebuild trust in journalism? And secondly, what do we need to do to strengthen the role of community-based journalism in debate and discussion?
Well, just to the latter one, I do think that is the major crisis right now in American journalism is the absolute toppling of important state and local based news organizations. And you see that in the course of the pandemic, how incredibly important it is to have accountability at every level of government, to have transparency. And I really fear that that's exactly what we're losing. We have, especially because of the disruptions and the spectacle of national politics in the last few years, we have extensive, if not endless, coverage at the national level and out of Washington. But at the same time, you have news organizations that have covered state capitals for decades, if not for centuries, going out of business at an alarming rate. So I'm extremely concerned about that. You do see some promising new nonprofit startups that are aiming to fill that void, but I fear that it's too slow. And again, what I would say from the last few years, the takeaway that applies both to politics and to journalism is don't take the present or the recent past for granted. What we've learned is that what we universalized as sort of the American way is not, and it's up to each generation to, take possession of it and to take responsibility for it. And the severing of the link that I always perceive to be the case between transparency, which is what we journalists strive to offer, transparency, independence, critical thinking, and some sort of accountability in our political system. To me, that is the crisis that is affecting both journalism and politics. Where was the accountability for any of the actions of the last few years? We're about to go into not one, but the second impeachment trial of a president. It's very, very likely to end in his acquittal. Where's the accountability for the shocking actions that led to the storming of the United States Capitol for the first time since 1814 during the War of 1812? You know, individual people who went in there, we now have this massive FBI manhunt. They're going to go to jail. There are going to be trials. Where's the accountability for the people in suits who were the ones who ultimately, whose rhetoric, whose media platforms led them to that moment? I don't have an answer for that, but I think that is the explanation in part for why we're facing this tremendous crisis of confidence and trust right now in our society.
So another question, again, with respect to journalism and media, is the role and the challenge that social media presents to more traditional journalism, but also this notion of consideration of objectively of facts and using it to build a point of view. How do we restore trust in the profession of journalism, more formally defined, when people seem to be increasingly getting their information from social media, which is not necessarily, in fact, is rarely objectively verified?
Yeah, I think it's a real interesting dilemma here. And I think the problem is that, it is hard to know what to trust, right? And that's why legacy news organizations and new news organizations need to build a record of factual, reliable, trustworthy reporting. And when we get things wrong, and we all do because we're human, we need to, correct things. And I think that's, something that's different than social media. And I think the consumers need to take some responsibility here too, right? Because as consumers, we all need to think about where we're getting our information, what's trustworthy and what's not. Social media by itself can be a great thing because it is a proliferator of information, but you have to be careful to understand where it is. We teach our son, don't trust everything you see on the internet or on social media until you know where it comes from. And if it comes from a brand name that has a record of accuracy and reliability, then that's one thing, I would put the New York Times and New Yorker in that category and many others, but be careful to know where it comes from. And so there's a consumer angle of this as well as a producer angle of this, I think, that we need to think about.
Finally, could James Baker succeed at all in this current environment, given what we've just been talking about, the fragmentation of politics, but also the fragmentation of information sources? How would James Baker succeed in this setting?
It is the question in many ways, and it is one that we've wrestled with without having a definitive answer. Look, the bottom line is that certainly in terms of his own career, Jim Baker would succeed because he's wired for success. And I have no doubt that he would have flourished in this or any era. He was an accidental creature of politics, however, and so it's very unlikely in many ways that he would have entered politics in Washington if it weren't for his relationship with George Herbert Walker Bush. The truth is that the country's polarization and gridlock, it predates Donald Trump. It's going to post-date Donald Trump. But we did come away from this long study of one individual, very exceptional American life, I think, with a renewed sense that individuals do matter. And the bottom line is that the story of this period in American politics is definitely shaped by Jim Baker and his accidental presence at the height. So I remain an optimist that individuals matter and that outcomes can differ as a result of them.
Peter, Susan, thank you. And thanks for doing this. The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. I honestly, sincerely, and forcefully recommend it. It is a great way to understand modern politics, modern diplomacy, where we were and where we've come to. So thanks very much. David, I'll turn it back to
That's
you.
wonderful. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mark, thanks very much. And let me salute, I think, two of the best in the business, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. Thanks very much for taking the time. We posted the link to the book in the chat for everyone to see, and do agree 100% with Mark. Strongly recommend getting the book. So Peter, we're going to let you go, but we're going to keep Susan on because we asked Susan to pull double duty to moderate the next session. We're going to take a 14-minute break now, and we'll come back and we'll start with the next panel at 10 a.m. Eastern time. Thanks.
Thank you. I can, yeah, let's just keep this link on.
As a student who is interested in looking to go into politics in the future, having the experience of State of the World is one of the best things that we can get.
So at this event, we will see panelists throughout the 2 days from all walks of life. There are journalists, there are scholars, there are actual diplomats themselves, and they discuss prevalent issues to today's international communities.
Human trafficking is now part of the conversation.
Our original response on the 29th of December to their rocket attacks on us on the 27th of December was absolutely justifiable and right under international law.
I don't think that if you talk to any Democrat, they would tell you that impeachment was good politics for them.
This is an experience that students don't get on a daily basis because despite the fact that you can learn a lot in classes and in lectures, you can't experience having a real-life policymaker, a real-life scientist there in front of you, explaining to you the intricacies of these foreign situations and conflicts.
You've assembled such an amazing group of people here that it's become this sort of meeting place early in the new year. So it's to really become the first conference of the new year.
State of the World proves that every concept we learn in poli-sci courses, in international relations courses, in any one of those social sciences, how they are applicable to real-day issues and events that we are seeing.
Hopefully when you leave here today, you'll be enabled to have an even louder voice than you already have.
I think you've really established something here at FIU that you should be very proud of.